Hi everyone, welcome to our poster presentation for the SASH conference. My name is Kim Nguyen.
I'm Alejandra Bredo.
And I'm Abigail Matthews, and we're with the University of Southern California. And our presentation is called Breaking Bars, Implementing and Destigmatizing Rehabilitation Among Sex Offenders. So this is our overall poster, but we will go into more detail in each section in the following slides. So first off, our introduction. In the US legal system, sex offenders are considered to be serious criminals. Currently, sex offenders are tried and classed into a three-tier system based on the severity of their offense. Once released from prison, they must stay on the sex offender registry for a minimum of 10 years. However, studies have shown that sex offenders often experience psychological morbidities. The current system we have in place of imprisoning sex offenders and requiring them to register to the sex offenders registry fails to address these psychological morbidities. These disorders include paraphilic and personality disorders. Also, sex offenders sometimes are victims themselves of sex abuse as children, adding on to the psychological trauma that sex offenders often experience. While being a victim of abuse does not inherently cause the victim to become an abuser later in their life, these two are correlated. In order to address these behavioral and psychological issues, we want to consider rehabilitation as a treatment option, not only to reduce recidivism rates among sex offenders, but also to treat offenders and manage their behaviors. Rehabilitation for sex offenders is crucial to allow these individuals to take responsibility for their actions, educate them to reconstruct cognitively distorted thoughts, and to give them the necessary tools to integrate into society after incarceration. Our research goal is to evaluate the critical components for the successful implementation and destigmatization of rehabilitation among sex offenders. So we have three research objectives. Our first objective is to compile the different methods previously used to rehabilitate sex offenders, including therapeutic interventions and mental health treatments for sex offenders during and after incarceration. Also, we will address their effectiveness in recidivism reduction and creating long-term benefits for society. Our second objective is to challenge the bygone belief that all sex crimes are the same and that sex offenders do not deserve to receive rehabilitation. And our last objective is to highlight the complexities of the US legal system, wrongful convictions of sex crimes based on race and gender, and the damaging retribution upon sex offenders.
And so we conducted a literature review to examine the different kinds of rehabilitation for sex offenders and to identify common treatments. We used Google Scholar and PubMed and looked up keywords like sex offender and rehabilitation. We then analyzed the different treatments and evaluated the benefits of the different rehabilitation types for the sex offenders. Then we researched strategies to effectively implement and destigmatize rehabilitation. And so here are a couple of the results that we came up with. We started getting information on what current punishments of sex offenders look like in society. Currently, criminal laws and policies really rely on retribution instead of rehabilitation to punish sex offenders. So for example, like Abby mentioned, there's the use of registration and community notification laws, such as like the Megan laws, which intend to prevent recidivism and protect the community, when in reality it kind of creates this stigma against rehabilitation. And there's also laws in certain states that require the chemical and physical castration, which again increases the stigma against sexual offenders without addressing the root causes. And so in contrast to imprisonment and castration, there's rehabilitation, which is designed to not only reduce recidivism rates, but also treat offenders to manage their behaviors. And so in treatment, a psychologist or a trained professional would work with the offender to take responsibility for their actions while treating these co-occurring disorders. So the sex offender works toward recognizing their wrongfulness in their actions and ultimately which ultimately decreases the rate of recidivism. And currently, the treatments vary between offense and the eligibility for the sex offender. This also depends on the willingness to participate, the risk level, and the seriousness of the sex offense, and of course, the availability of these treatments. And so these were a couple of the big treatments that are like the big umbrella themes that we found for the treatments. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is usually in a group setting, which addresses like irrational thoughts and beliefs that led the offenders to engage in like antisocial behaviors. And also it provides a way for the offenders to correct their deviant thoughts by practicing opportunities to model and engage in pro-social and problem-thinking skills and behaviors. Then we also found psychotherapy and counseling, which uses insightful or insight-oriented therapy. And this is both individual and group setting, and is similar to the traditional therapy practices. So exploring underlying causes and thoughts related to the offending behaviors. And then medical treatment, which of course what we propose is for surgical castration to be entirely volunteer basis. And there's also hormone therapy. And so going on with the types of treatments, there actually have been many studies that demonstrate that rehabilitation is more effective in reducing recidivism, which is something that we really strive to implement. We found that psychosocial or psychoeducational programs are a great way, and they tackle many common components of the sexual offense, which is like emotional management for victim empathy. And it varies between person and sexual offender, and it's a very individualized plan. This will include classes and exercises like emotional management, cognitive reconstructing, relapse prevention, and other aspects. And so we found actually 2 studies that highly supported or that supported the idea that high intense treatments programs for high risk sex offenders reduce the recidivism rates as to compared to those that didn't receive any of the psychoeducational programs. And another treatment that we found was group therapy, which allows the offenders to reflect on their behaviors with others. And there's a couple of benefits, like promoting that community cohesiveness and also support among other offenders. And it really allows them to identify and address the root causes of sexuality and generally aggressive behaviors that they face. And then we also found transitional education programs, and that is with the different collaboration of the offenders support system. So this can be parents, friends and family, and that encourages the offenders to integrate back into society. So it prepares them to integrate to their communities and reach treatment goals, and is usually makes them aware of the nature and the impact of offending and the risk of reoffending. But overall, it's to educate and support the person with the risk response strategies.
Thank you, Alejandra. So I will now talk about the benefits of destigmatizing rehabilitation. So destigmatizing rehabilitation encourages sex offenders to seek therapy because, as Alejandra has mentioned, they can refuse the rehabilitation treatment. However, when they do that, they also may receive harsher prison sentences and also fines, which cause a greater, larger economic burden on themselves and also taxpayers. Secondly, rehabilitation destigmatization also encourages individuals with thoughts of committing sexual offenses to seek therapy, which prevents sex crimes in the beginning. Furthermore, in order to destigmatize rehabilitation, then the public need to understand that sex crime usually stem from external factors such as mental illnesses and abusive households. So punishing sex offenders does not rectify the harm done to the victim. And instead, by rehabilitating, it can carry the benefits such as reducing recidivism and protecting the public from future sex crimes. Next slide, please. So for our conclusion, we determined that in order to successfully implement rehabilitation programs for sex offenders, we need to have the offenders to have an individualized plan. So draft an individual plan for themselves. So as Alejandra has mentioned, there are multiple modules in the psychoeducational programs such as cognitive restructuring, morals and values, etc. So by really understanding the sex offender situation and drafting an individualized plan, we can help them more effectively. And secondly, if they are, for example, having problems with drugs or alcohol, then giving them the chemical dependency treatment will also help them. So we need to understand that. Next, we need to also address the root causes. So what are the root causes? Is it chemical dependency? Is it the childhood abuse? Is it the mental illnesses? We need to look into the root causes to effectively address those problems. We also need to build a positive and safe environment for the offenders and the professionals, such as the psychologists who work with them or the social workers, the professionals who facilitate the conversation during the group counseling and working with them day by day during the treatment. In order to destigmatize, we need to also increase awareness of the benefits of rehabilitation. So how it is more effective than the traditional approach of retribution, because rehabilitation can reduce recidivism, allow the offenders to actually contribute to society. Next slide, please. So for future directions, we are advocating for more fundings to make rehabilitation more accessible to sex offenders. So currently, only certain sex offenders receive rehabilitation based on the risk assessment tools such as Static 99 or Minnesota Sex Offender Assessment Risk. And based on those scores, certain sex offenders will be prioritized to receive the treatment and many will not be. So by allocate more funding to these programs, we can give more sex offenders to have the treatment when they should have, but they are unable to. Secondly, we hope to make the mental health and social work services more accessible to abuse youth because, as we have discussed, abused childhood is also one of the external factors that could potentially cause an individual to later on commit sex crime if they do not have the support system they should have when they are facing these emotional trauma. And also, these can also lead to psychological comorbidities. So by having these mental health resources, we can really help these individuals. And lastly, we hope to increase education in consensual sex and sexual dynamics for the general youth so they know how to engage in sex and also consensual sex and explore these topics without feeling stigmatized. Next slide, please. And this is our references. Thank you so much for tuning in to our conference presentation, and we hope that you enjoy this presentation. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.